Alright, hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf. We are continuing the Lectures on the Proofs of God by Hegel. We are on the 10th lecture, and we have finally arrived at the discussion of the proofs themselves. 10th lecture is the Cosmological Proof. Oh no, I'm not tired. It's just, I'm talking a bit lower than normal, I suppose. The house feels a bit quiet, so. Anyways. 10th lecture, the Cosmological Proof. Which will be a very long set of lectures. It's about 7 lectures on the cosmological proofs, the various versions of it, and the various problems. The first aspect of the proofs under consideration presupposes the world in general and its contingency in particular. The starting point is formed by empirical things and by the whole composed of these things, the world. The whole is certainly superior to its parts, the whole, that is, defined as a unity that embraces and defines all the parts, such as the whole of a house, or even more so, the whole that is a self-subsisting unity, such as the soul of a living body. By world, however, we understand merely the aggregate of worldly things, merely a connection of the infinite quantity of existing things that we have in view before us, each of which is represented initially as subsisting for itself. The world comprises within itself human beings as much as natural things. When the world is taken as this aggregate, even only of natural things, it is not represented as nature, but by which we understand something that is inwardly a systematic whole, a system of arrangements and levels, and especially of laws. The term world merely expresses the aggregate in such a way that, resting as it does simply on the existing mass of things, it has no advantage, at least no qualitative advantage, over worldly things.
Okay, so I have questions about that right off the bat. Because when you've spoken to me about these lectures before, you've described it as like one of 3 possible like starting points for Hegel's system. The science of logic, and the phenomenology of spirit. And it seems like this wouldn't be such a good starting point if it has to presuppose so many things to start with.
Well, it's a way to get you into the logic. The presuppositions can be explicit or they can be implicit. Like presupposition as such is not an issue, simply because, like even with the science of logic, what we find is that with being, there's an implicit active presupposition, regardless of whether we want it to be there or not. So even when we do what is intellectually the required thing, which is just to think immediately, that itself actually presupposes becoming, which actually presupposes existence, which actually presupposes all the other things. And so the presupposition is not itself an issue here. Just like how you can begin with anything. So long as the presupposition is clear, but the concept is allowed to move, it's no problem. Like I would imagine that these are not a positive way to enter the system, so much as a negative way, because issues arise but are also dissolved in the understanding of these. But yeah, I had said that this was something somebody else said could be considered a third introduction. I can somewhat see it, but since we've just gotten to the proofs, I'm not sure that this is the case for the proofs themselves. All these first 9 lectures were a fairly okay introduction to a generalized explanation of a problem and a bit of explanation as to what Hegel's methodology is. I think Hegel's right when he says that there is a sense in which these are supplementary lectures. This is a supplementary set of problems that if you're going to the logic, looking at these will probably give you a concrete vision of what is at stake with certain things. But yeah, we'll see how he goes about it. This thing about the world, that's interesting. The world comprises within itself human beings as much as natural things. So by world, we don't mean nature as such. We just mean all things present, I suppose. Which is really to be talking about consciousness, what is present in and to consciousness.
The universe.
Yeah, you could say that. Although I think people tend to think of the universe as a natural entity. Although they don't make any proper distinctions as to what actually is natural. These things further define themselves for us in a variety of ways, above all as limited being, as finitude, contingency, etc. That's just from such a starting point, spirit elevates itself to God. It adjudges limited, finite, or contingent being to be an untrue form of being above and beyond which true being is to be found. It escapes into the region of another being, a limitless being that is presumed to be essential being, as opposed to inessential external being. The world of finitude, temporality, change, perishability is not what is true. Rather, the infinite, eternal, unchangeable is the true. Even if what we have called the limitless being, the infinite, eternal, the unchangeable, does not succeed in expressing the entire fullness of what we call God, God is nonetheless limitless being, infinite, eternal, unchangeable, and an elevation occurs to at least these divine predicates, or rather that these abstract yet universal qualities of the divine nature, an elevation at least to that universal substance into the pure aether in which God dwells. So depending on what one understands here to be proper objects of cognition, this may make sense or may not. I was talking to an empiricist yesterday for whom the question of what is a proper concept didn't make any sense. And then a day before we were talking, well, not you guys, but I spent about half an hour amusing myself by entertaining a so-called Pyrrhonian skeptic who could not admit that he understood or did not understand the words that were coming through my text. Like the distinction of this essential, the finite, infinite, whatever, particularly the contingent, ends up being a rather trivial logical distinction. Now, the distinction as such is not proven here, but it is a valid distinction, and it is a true one. And we cannot help but do it, mainly because we have that concept of very much intuitively ingrained in just the way that we operate as cognitive beings with purpose and reason. Continuing, this elevation as such is the fact in the history of the human spirit that constitutes religion, but religion only generally, that is, wholly abstractly. Thus the elevation is the general, but only general foundation of religion. That's to say that the rise from the empirical and contingent to the purely rational and eternal appears in history as partly as a religion. That religion pulls people away from the immediacy of materiality and empirical concerns and makes them face towards something immaterial, something eternal, something not finite, which ends up only properly being thought, but of course in religion begins as representations, intuitive representations, which also are mixed in with thought abstractions, but which are not taken as pure thoughts themselves. The principle of immediate knowledge does not go does not get beyond this elevation as a fact. It appeals to and rests on it as a fact with the certainty that this universal fact in human beings, indeed in all humans, is what is called the inner revelation of God in the human spirit or reason. We have already sufficiently examined this principle, and I refer to it here once more, only insofar as we confine ourselves to the fact in question. This very fact, the elevation itself, is as such rather something that is immediately an act of mediation. It has its beginning, its starting point in finite contingent existence in worldly things, but then is an advance to something altogether other. It is consequently mediated by that beginning, and it is an elevation to what is infinite and in itself necessary only because it does not remain standing with that beginning, which is here alone the immediate, and immediate that later exhibits a merely relative character, but abandons and surrenders such a standpoint immediately. This elevation, which is consciousness, is thus in itself mediated knowledge. So I assume that the principle of immediate knowledge of faith, it appeals to and rests on it as a fact with the certainty that it is universal, that this universal fact in human beings, indeed in all humans, is what is called the inner revelation of God in the human spirit or reason. So, one way that I think you probably frame this is that to even posit that this is something that comes from God, is some kind of connection to God. Two, that this is something that is a revelation of God already necessarily. And three, that it's something that happened to you, that's within you as a human being. Clearly shows that there are implicit mediations all over the place in these claims of immediate knowledge. This very fact, the elevation itself, is as such rather something that is immediately an act of mediation. It has its beginning, its starting point in finite, contingent existence in worldly things, but then is an advance to something altogether other. So the fact that you make a distinction between that as the immediate truth, the truth as such, and then like the rest of the world, which is an illusion or whatever, is already mediation. So immediate knowledge fails to be immediate. With regard to the beginning from which this elevation proceeds, we may here further remark that the content is not a sensible one, not an empirically concrete content of sensation or intuition, nor a concrete content of fanciful imagination. Rather, the elevation proceeds from the abstract thought determinations or categories implicit in the finitude and contingency of the world. The goal at which the elevation arrives is of a similar kind, the infinitude and absolute necessity of God, thought of not in a more developed and richer articulation, but solely in these general categories. With regard to this aspect, it must be said that the universality of the fact of this elevation is false in respect to its form. For example, it can be maintained that even among the Greeks, the thought of infinity, of self-subsisting necessity, as the ultimate principle of everything, belonged only to the philosophers. Worldly things generally did not lie before representational thinking in the abstract form of worldly contingent finite things, but rather in their empirically concrete shape. Similarly, God was not represented in the categories of the infinite, eternal, and intrinsically necessary, but in the specific shapes of fanciful imagination. Still less is it the case that such universal forms are found explicitly in the consciousness of less developed peoples. These forms do, to be sure, cross the minds, as we say, of all humans, because they are thinking beings, and when they are fixed in language, they are further developed into conscious thought upon which proof proper is based. But even then, they function initially as characteristics of concrete objects and have no need to be fixed in consciousness as independent of their own right, in their own right. It was to the culture of our time that these categories of thought first became familiar, and they are now universal, or at least universally diffused. But even this culture has not reached this insight as something immediate, but as mediated through the varied course of thought and the study of linguistic usage. The same is no less true of the already mentioned cultures that are unpracticed in the independence of representational thinking. People have essentially learned to think and have developed fluency in thought. The formation of abstract representational thinking involves an infinitely manifold process of mediation. The one essential fact in the fact of elevation is that it is a mediation. And so I think that makes sense, and certainly from what we have from history, I think that's very true. That despite how these are imminent to our thinking about the world, they don't necessarily ever become explicit for everyone at all times. The idea that the Greeks did not think of infinity or self-subsisting necessity as such, and being something that they ascribed to the world, and things, in particular things in the world, does seem strangely not as common as we might suppose. Like for the Chinese, the very ideas of the absolute, such as the Tao, didn't really come down to concretion, and one could say, well, yes, the Tao is the all, it is the infinite, it is no thing, and so on and so on. Nonetheless, this wasn't a thing that regular people understood that way. That was a thing that philosophers understood that way. For the average person, the Tao is just the all. We would call it like you could analogize it, and people do analogize it to the Force in Star Wars. Just that the all in everything, which for the average person is just another representation as well. Continuing. It is a circumstance that the elevation of the spirit to God has mediation within itself, which invites to proof, that is, to the setting forth of the individual moments of the process of spirit, and indeed in the form of thought. It is spirit in its innermost aspect, namely in its thought, that produces this elevation. An elevation that is the process of its categories. What should happen by means of proof is that such an activity of thinking is brought to consciousness, that consciousness recognizes this activity to be a nexus of cognitional moments. Against an exposition such as this, which unfolds itself in the field mediating thought, faith, which wishes to continue to be immediate certainty, protests, and so too does the criticism of the understanding, which is at home in the intricacies of that mediation, but for purposes of confusing the elevation itself. So let's see. Going back to the top, it is a circumstance that the elevation of the spirit to God has mediation within itself, which invites to proof, that is, to the setting forth of the individual moments of the process of spirit, and indeed in the form of thoughts. So the circumstance of the elevation, that the elevation of spirit to God has mediation within itself, is what invites proof. And proof is the setting forth of the individual moments of the process of spirit, and indeed in the form of thought. It is spirit in its innermost aspect, namely in its thought, that produces this elevation, an elevation that is the process of its categories. It's something to be noted. The elevation is the process of the categories. So mediation is present from the beginning, even if we believe it to be immediate. Because mediation is present, and because we are spirit, which is self-cognizing, this mediation can become present to us, and due to the way that reason operates, we will investigate that which is the mediation of these immediate things, and that in itself will create this generative process of the categories. So even if you don't begin with God, for example, and you just begin with something like being, Hegel has said here in these lectures, as well as in many other places of his writings, that it doesn't matter. You will get to the final mediation, which is God, concretely speaking. As far as faith is concerned, we may say that, however many faults the understanding may find with these proofs, and whatever defective points there may be in their explication of the elevation of the spirit from the contingent and temporal to the infinite eternal, the human heart will not allow itself to be deprived of this elevation. Insofar as the human heart has been encroached upon by the understanding, faith has on the one hand appealed to it to hold fast to this elevation, and not to trouble itself with the fault-finding of the understanding. But it has on the other hand told itself not to trouble about the proof at all in order to attain the greatest security, and out of self-interest it has aligned itself with the critical understanding against proof. Faith will not allow itself to be robbed of its elevation to God, that is, of its witness to the truth, because this elevation is intrinsically necessary, is more than some sort of accidental fact relating to spirit. There are facts and inner experiences in spirit, and still more in the spirits. For spirit exists not as an abstraction, but as the many spirits. Facts of an infinitely varied sort, and sometimes of the most opposite and depraved character. In order that this fact may be rightly comprehended as a fact of spirit and not of the ephemeral and contingent spirits, it is requisite to grasp it in its necessity. Only this necessity vouches for this rightness in this contingent and arbitrary sphere. The sphere to which this higher fact belongs is further the sphere of abstraction on its own account. Not only is it very difficult to have a clear and definite consciousness of abstraction and its relations, but also abstraction itself as a danger that becomes unavoidable once abstraction has entered in. Once the believing human heart has tasted of the tree of knowledge, and thought has begun to spring up within it in the free and independent shape that is peculiar to it. So here, main thing to note is that faith and the elevation to God is intrinsically necessary, is more than some sort of accidental fact relating to spirit. Concretely, I would say that this is Hegel linking the necessity of religion and reason itself, that this isn't some quirk like a lot of modern new atheists want to say, that somehow there was a mistake with religion, that religion was a sort of a deviation of proper reasoning and could have been avoided had we just had they could probably continue circumstances in which this wouldn't have come up. And Hegel's saying here, no, God is a necessary conclusion immanent to reason itself. This elevation to God is required, that the acceptance of radical finitude, of nihilism, of what would you call it, nominalism, is inimical to reason. And therefore, when the understanding comes about and says, well, these things we can't actually know, and they might not be real anyways, they might be illusions, Hegel here says that it is right for faith to turn away from reason, which puts it under attack, puts its certainty in God and the infinity of reality to an essential sense, rather than accept it. But it mistakes when it finds that the understanding, particularly here the Kantian understanding, the Kantian philosophy, has turned the understanding as such into a weapon against knowledge itself, and therefore faith, since it has put itself against knowledge because of its original attacks, then sides with the understanding, both for its own sake, but also against knowledge and the understanding itself, funny enough. Continue reading again. In order that this fact may be rightly comprehended as a fact of spirit, and not the ephemeral contingent spirit, it is requisite to grasp it in its necessity. Only this necessity vouches for its rightness in its contingent arbitrary sphere. The sphere to which this higher fact belongs is further sphere of abstraction on its own account. So here the questions of God's existence or the proofs of God, which are not just mere questions of existence, necessarily lead us to the sphere of abstraction on its own account, necessarily lead us to the questions of pure reason itself, or metaphysics as such. So the question of God is not some kind of contingent thing that we could do without, but it's a necessary step in the very arising of knowledge. I don't know if... well, you're probably definitely not familiar with this, Josh, but there's a whole tradition of theology which tries to make the arguments that without God, reason is impossible. So I think that this is mostly famous with Aquinas and a few others of medieval theologians, but pretty well known, pretty famous set of arguments. And here Hegel's kind of giving a nod towards those arguments, that the thought of God is going to necessarily lead us to the thought of pure reason itself. But for different reasons they probably had. Continuing. Now if we look more closely at the setting for the inner course followed by spirit in thought and through the moments of thought, we have already noted that the initial starting point represents a category of thought, namely that of the contingency of worldly things. Accordingly, the first form of elevation is found historically in the so-called cosmological proof of the existence of God. We have also pointed out that the specificity of the goal to which we elevate ourselves depends on the specificity of the starting point. Worldly things might be defined another way, and in that case the result of the truth would have a different specification. We might have differences that would appear unimportant to less cultivated thought, but that in the sphere of thought we presently occupy are the very thing with which we are concerned and of which we must give an account. Thus, if things were to be defined in a general way as existing, it could be shown that the truth of existence as determinate being is being itself, indeterminate, limitless being. God would thus be defined simply as being the most abstract definition with which, as is well known, the Eleatics started. This is a good point. Seems banal to us if we're familiar with Hegel, but apparently it's just not a banal point, and it has to be explained to everyone else. Well, not everybody else, but most people, maybe most philosophers. That the specificity of the goal to which we elevate ourselves depends on the specificity of the starting point. The content sets the form. The question already presupposes and determines the very form of the answer which can arise to answer it. It's that speculative unity of content and form. Therefore, if the question is of definitions, if we just define things in different ways, then the question completely changes as to what will the development in the answer be. We recall this abstraction most vividly in the connection with the distinction already made between thinking in its inner and implicit form and the bringing forth of thoughts into consciousness. Who is there who does not use the word being? The weather is fine. Where are you? And so on ad infinitum. And who, when engaging in representational activity, does not therefore make use of this pure category of thought, although it is concealed in the concrete content, the weather, etc., of which consciousness in forming such representations is composed, and of which alone it has any knowledge. There is an infinite difference between the possession and use of the category being in this way, and its employment by the Eleatics, who gave it a fixed meaning on its own account and conceived of it as the ultimate principle, as the absolute, along with God at least, or apart from any God at all. Moreover, when things are defined as finite, spirit elevates itself from them to the infinite. Likewise, when they are defined as real being, spirit elevates itself to the infinite, to the infinite as to what is ideal or ideal being. Or if they are defined expressly as having being only immediate, then spirit elevates itself from this mere immediacy as a semblance to essential being, which it regards as the ground of immediacy. Or elevates itself from things as parts to God as the whole, or from external and selfless things to God as the power behind them, or from things as effects to their cause. All these definitions are given to things by thought, and in the same way the categories of being, infinite, ideal, essence and ground, whole, power, cause, are used to speak of God. They may indeed be used of God, but only in passing fashion, since it is indeed the case that God really is being, infinite, essence, whole, power, etc. They do not exhaust God's nature, and God is deeper and richer than anything such definitions can express. They advance from any such initial definition of existence as representative of the finite in general to the final definition of God's nature, namely of the infinite in thought, is to be called a proof in exactly the same way as those proofs which the name has been formally applied, to which the name has been formally applied. In such a way, the number of proofs goes far beyond the several that have already been indicated. Yep. Just go count the categories, the number of categories in Hegel's systems, and that's the number of proofs that you got. Let's see. Infinite. Well, the infinite seems to be generalized in many ways. I know that there's some religions and theologies in which that's specifically an operative concept, but none come to my mind right now. The ideal, well, obviously that was in Plato, Platonism, Neoplatonism, essence and ground. You could say that's the predominating aspect of these proofs, particularly the cosmological proofs, and also what Leibniz, the Leibnizian tradition up to Kant, sees as being God's role, being the essence and ground of reality. The whole, maybe Aristotle, although Aristotle also uses the arguments of the generality of being for the highest being. Power, that's Spinoza. Cause, that's also generalized to the Enlightenment theologies, I suppose. Continuing, the categories of contingency and necessity. From what point of view are we to regard this further increase that has sprung up in a way that is perhaps uncomfortable for us? We cannot exactly reject its multiplicity. To the contrary, once we have placed ourselves at the standpoint of those mediations of thoughts that are recognized as proofs, we have to explain why, in thus adducing them, we have confined and can confine ourselves to just the number mentioned and to the categories contained in them. In reference to this new and further expanded multiplicity, we should recall principally what has been said about the proofs that appeared earlier and in more limited form. This multiplicity of starting points that presents itself is nothing other than the larger number of categories that are common in the field of logical reflection, and we have only to show how the former point to the latter. They show themselves to be nothing other than the series of continuous determinations of the concept, not of any sort of concept, but of the concept in itself. They are the development of the concept in an externalization, whereby it enters into itself just as deeply. The one side in this progression is the finite determinateness of a form of the concept, while the other side is its proximate truth, which is in its turn only a more concrete and deeper form of truth than the preceding one. The highest stage of one sphere is at the same time the beginning of a higher sphere. Logic develops this progressive determination of the concept in terms of its necessity. Each stage through which it passes involves to this extent the elevation of a category of finitude into its infinitude. Thus, from its starting point onwards, it involves just as much a metaphysical conception of God and, since this elevation is grasped in its necessity, a proof of God's being. Thus also the transition from one stage to a higher stage comes about as a necessary progression toward a more concrete and deeper determination, not simply as a series of randomly gleamed conceptions, a progression toward wholly concrete truths, toward the consummate manifestation of the concept, toward the equalization of these manifestations with itself. Logic is, to this extent, metaphysical theology, which treats of the evolution of the idea of God in the aether of pure thought, and thus it properly attends only to this idea which is utterly independent in and for itself. Big emphasis on that, utterly independent in and for itself. The logic is existent independently in and for itself. While one usually sees the syllogism of Hegel's understanding of the final form of the system to be logic and nature sublated by spirit, the reality is that it is logic which sublates nature and spirit, because logic is the one form where the absolute as absolute appears absolutely. Spirit, because it is existent, still considered, though it sublates nature, it still takes its existence within the world of nature and empirical temporal-spatial reality. Does not hold the independence which logic does. And here I suppose it must be clear that logic as logos is what is meant. Continuing. Such an exposition is not the object of these lectures. We wish to confine ourselves here to the historical discussion of these conceptual determinations, from which we may view the elevation to the determinations that are the truths of the concept and that may be regarded as the conceptual determinations of God. The reason for the more general deficiency in considering the conceptual determinations can only be the lack in awareness of the nature of the conceptual determinations themselves and of their connection with each other, as well as the nature of the elevation from them as finite to the infinite. The more proximate reason why the specifications of the contingency of the world and of the absolutely necessary being or essence that corresponds to it appear as a starting point and result of the proof. And this reason is at the same time a relative justification for the preference given them, is to be found in the fact that the category of the relationship of contingency and necessity is the one in which all the relations between the finitude and infinitude of being are summed up and brought together. Alright, so why contingency and necessity? Because these pretty nicely sum up the entire logic of essence. The most concrete determination of the finitude of being is contingency. And likewise, the infinitude of being finds its most concrete determination in necessity. Being in its own most essential quality is actuality, and actuality is in itself, in fact, the relationship between contingency and necessity that finds its complete determination in absolute necessity. Finitude, by being taken up in the category of contingency, has the advantage of being prepared, so to speak, to such a degree that it points in itself to the transition into its truth, or necessity. The term contingency, or accident, already suggests a kind of existence whose special character is to fall to God. Is to fall to God another specification? Oh, sorry. Misheard that. Necessity itself, however, has its truth in freedom. With it we enter into a new sphere, the region of the concept itself. Accordingly, this affords another condition for the determination of finitude and for the course of elevation to God, another specification of the starting point and the result, namely that of purposiveness and purpose or end. This then becomes the category for a further proof of the existence of God. But the concept is not simply submerged in objectivity as it is when, as end, it is merely the determination of things. Rather, the concept is for itself existing independently of objectivity. Regarded in this way, it is itself the starting point, and its transition has a distinctive determination of its own, which has already been referred to. The fact, therefore, that the first proof, the cosmological proof, adopts the category of the relationship of contingency and absolute necessity finds, as has been remarked, its relative justification in the fact that this relationship is the most proper, concrete, and ultimate determination of actuality. As such, and thus is, and comprises within itself the truth of the more abstract categories of being, taken collectively. Thus, the movement of this relationship comprises within itself the movement of all the earlier and more abstract categories of finitude to the still more abstract determinations of infinitude, or rather what presents itself in it is in an abstract and logical sense the movement or progression of the proof, that is, the form of the syllogism, which in all cases is one and the same. Okay, that's the 10th lecture, and this was, the last two paragraphs were pretty dense, but I don't know, they seem pretty easy to follow for me. It's just about that we can already see just at face, with a little bit of a thinking and analysis, that the proofs actually connect to each other logically. That the actual logical resolution of the issues of contingency and necessity bring us to the standpoint which opens up the very intelligibility of teleology in the concept, purposiveness, and then that itself, I assume, is also going to open up the possibility and intelligibility of the ontological proof as the self-conceptualizing concept in the end as well. I don't know, any questions on that? I suppose not. So let's move on to the 11th lecture.
I actually have one question.
All right.
So, how would one distinguish? Like, can you explain a bit more about the difference between necessity and absolute necessity?
He's going to go over it during the lectures. I myself have not read that section of the logic, so I could not tell you what the relationship as such is. I assume that absolute necessity would be concerning the necessity of necessity.
Yeah, like the necessity for necessity. Like the necessity to have necessity in the first place.
So yeah, I haven't actually looked at that. I could give the science of logic a cursory look here. Book 2, Doctrine of Essence, Appearance, Actuality. Necessity, where is this? Let's see, actuality as itself immediate form unity of inner and outer is thus in the determination of immediacy as against the determination of immanent reflection, or it is an actuality as against a possibility. The connection of the two to each other is the third, the actual determinant of both, as being reflected into itself, and as this being immediately existing. This third is necessity, so actuality, possibility, necessity. But first, since the actual and the possible are formal distinctions, their connection is likewise only formal, and consists only in this, that the one, just like the other, is a positiveness or in contingency. So actuality, possibility, necessity then probably turns into the formal distinctions of positiveness and contingency. Second, because in contingency the actual as well as the possible are positiveness, because they have retained their determination, real actuality now arises, and with it also real possibility and relative necessity. Third, the reflection of relative necessity into itself yields absolute necessity, which is absolute possibility and actuality. Okay, so that's chapter 2 on actuality. See, absolute necessity is not so much the necessary, even less a necessary, but necessity, being simply as reflection. It is relation because it is a distinguishing whose moments are themselves the whole totality of necessity, and therefore subsist absolutely, but do so in such a way that their subsisting is one subsistence, and the difference only the reflective shine of the movement of exposition, and this reflective shine is the absolute itself. So it is relation because it is distinguishing whose moments are themselves the whole totality of necessity. So each moment sets up the whole circle of determinations as think of the dialectic, right? You know, where being and nothing just yield each other incessantly, and it is that endless circularity which is the totality of necessity. And therefore subsist absolutely, but do so in such a way that their subsisting is one subsistence, and the difference only the reflective shine of the movement of exposition, and this reflective shine is the absolute itself. Yeah, so it's basically what I would just put in slightly more vague but simpler and probably more understandable terms outside of the specific jargon as just necessary necessity, in which the circle of elements, the circle of parts or moments, because they yield each other incessantly, prove the necessity of the consequent proves the necessity of the antecedent, and in these together prove the necessity of their entire system. So necessary necessity, absolute necessity.
Yeah, necessary necessity within the system.
Yeah. What do you think, Spirit? I know you've read that whole Science of Logic. Would you say that's an okay explication there?
Well, when I went over it, I was not in the best shape, but I do remember him mentioning absolute necessity, and yeah, it's kind of like this necessity of necessity, and I think he says something about it, like, take everything together, all the possibilities and all the actualities, and when you find the right movement, like when you find the dialectic to it all, that's the necessity of necessity. Yeah, so I think it is this sort of self-reflective thing where when you think about it, it's kind of mind-blowing, the necessity of necessity. And then that kind of, I think that's one of the last steps before you get into the notion formally, or the concept. So yeah.
All right, thank you. Sorry, let's keep going. The argument from contingency to necessity. Following this discussion of the scope of the specific contents with which we are concerned, we shall now consider the course followed by the first of the elevations we have mentioned. We shall do so in the form in which it confronts us, which is simply that of reasoning from the contingency of the world to its absolute necessary essence. If we take up the formal expression of the syllogism in its particular elements, it runs as follows. The contingent does not rest upon itself, but upon the presupposition of something that is within itself absolutely necessary, something that is its essence, ground, cause. But the world is contingent. The individual things of the world are contingent, and it is a whole of the aggregate of these things. Therefore, the world presupposes something that is absolutely necessary within itself. The specific aspect from which this conclusion starts is the contingency of worldly things. If we take these things as we find them in sensation and representational thought, and if we compare what goes on in the human mind, we may indeed declare it to be an experience that worldly things taken by themselves are regarded as contingent. Individual things do not come from themselves or proceed by themselves. As contingent, they are destined to pass away. This is something that does not happen to them simply contingently, but is constitutive of their nature. Even if the course they follow is one that develops within them and is guided by rule and law, it goes on until it reaches their end, or rather leads only to their end. In like fashion, their existence is infringed upon by other things in all kinds of ways, and is brought to an end by external factors. If they are regarded as conditioned, then their conditions are things that exist independently outside of them, which may or may not correspond to them, and by which they may or may not be temporarily sustained. Initially, they are seen to be coordinated in space without being connected by any further relation that is part of their nature. The most heterogeneous elements are found side by side, and they can be separated without injury to each other's existence. Similarly, they follow one another externally in time. They are in fact finite, and however independent they may seem, they are essentially devoid of independence because of the limitations of their finitude. They are actual, but their actuality has the value merely of possibility. They are, but can equally well not be as be. By the way, that is a definition of possibility in the science of logic, that which can be just as much as not be. Their existence discloses, however, not only connections between conditions, that is, dependencies owing to which things come to be characterized as contingent, but also connections of cause and effect as the rule govern behavior of their inner and outer course of action, laws. These dependencies, this conformity to law, raise worldly things above the category of contingency to necessity, and the latter thus appears within the sphere that we have thought of as occupied only by contingencies. Contingency claims things in virtue of their isolation or singularization. Therefore, they may equally exist or not exist. But they are just as much the opposite, not isolated but utterly related to each other as determinate and delimited, but they are no better off as a result of this opposing determinacy. Isolation lends them the semblance of independence, but their connection with other things, that is, with each other, expresses the fact that individual things are at the same time not independent, shows that they are conditioned and affected by other things, that they are necessary by means of other things, not by means of themselves. Thus, these necessities themselves, these laws, are what constitute the independent element. Anything that exists essentially in a nexus of connection finds its determinate character and stability not in itself, but in this connection. It is the connection upon which things are dependent. But these connections, when defined as causes and effects, the condition and the fact of being conditioned, etc., are themselves limited in character and are contingent in relation to each other, in the sense that any of them may equally exist or not exist, and may just as easily be disturbed by circumstances, that is, interrupted by contingencies or demolished in their efficacy and validity, as the individual things over which they have no advantage in the matter of contingency. By contrast, those connections to which necessity must be attributed are not in any sense what we call things, but rather abstractions. If the connection of necessity manifests itself in the field of contingent things, in laws, and chiefly in relations of cause and effect, this necessity itself is something conditioned, limited, in fact, external. It is itself relegated to the category of things in respect to its isolation or externality on the one hand, and its conditionedness, limitation, and dependence on the other. In the connection of causes and effect, not only do we find the satisfaction that is lacking in the empty, unrelated isolation of things, which are just for this reason called contingent, but also the indefinite abstraction involved in the word things. The variableness in them disappears in this relationship of necessity in which things become causes, original facts, substances that are active and indeterminate. But in the connections of the sphere, the causes themselves are finite. Beginning as causes, their being is again isolated and therefore contingent, or it is not isolated, and in that case they are effects and therefore not independent but posited through another. The series of causes and effects are partly contingent vis-a-vis each other and partly continued of themselves into this so-called infinite. Thus they have as their content nothing but the situations and modes of existence of which each is finite on its own account, and what ought to give stability to the connection of the series, the infinite, is not only a beyond but also a mere negative, whose very meaning is merely relative to and conditioned by what ought to be negated by it, but for this reason is not negated. Okay, that was a bit long, there's some moves happening here, so I'm going to reread that a bit more slowly. So speaking of finite things, finite empirical things. Their existence discloses, however, not only connections between conditions, dependencies owing to which things come to be characterized as contingent, but also connections of cause and effect, the rule-governed laws, the rule-governed behavior of the inner and outer course of action, laws. So this happens in our cognition of the empirical all the time. We are meaning and reason-seeking beings. So we're always we're not always actively looking for causes, but sometimes causes are just so in your face that you cannot help but make the connection. So we start with just the empirical, merely contingent things, which are conditioned, which could be as well as not be. But they could be as well as then we seek for why they are or are not in the first place. At least that's the way I think that seems to be the way that we cognize things. So in just recognizing that things are contingent, then we ask for the reason, well, they could be as well as not be. They either are or are not. Now the question is, why? These dependencies, this conformity to law, raise worldly things above the category of contingency to necessity, and the latter thus appears within the sphere that we have thought of as occupied only by contingencies. Contingency claims things in virtue of their isolation or singularization. Therefore they may equally exist or not exist, but they are just as much the opposite, not isolated but utterly related to each other as determinate and delimited. Okay, this is key. So besides the possibility of just like the contingency of us noticing something, going, okay, man, that seems like a cause or an effect or whatever. The real logical reason, one may say, that we must look for the necessity of contingent things, because the whole thing about contingency is, well, in abstraction, as just independent things, considered independently, they can be as much as they can, as not be. But they exist. And existence is connection. And therefore it denies the very thing which contingency states, which is that these things are isolated abstractions, independent, which could just as well as be as not be. Well, they exist. Existence is connection. It is determinate being. This is conditioning. It is a conditioned being. It's a relationship to other, and then that which is contingent upon that other, which conditions it and allows for the very possibility of its existence. But once that relationship is made, the contingent transforms directly into its opposite. It now becomes a necessity. It is caused. It is conditioned. Does that make sense? Josh, DM, and Danny? Z?
Yep.
That was based.
Wait, so I really like this part, but can you just go over the part again where it transforms? So where contingency transforms to necessity.
So if the contingent, then he says up there. Let's just go back. Did I highlight where it says? Okay. The immediate empirical things they are actual, but their actuality has a value merely a possibility. They are, but it can equally as well not be. Actually, let's reread this whole thing, because, well, not the whole thing. Where is it? Let's just read it. The specific aspect from which this conclusion starts is the contingency of worldly things.
Okay, so it starts at contingent worldly things.
If we take these things as we find them in sensation and representational thought, and if we compare what goes on in the human mind, we may indeed declare it to be an experience that worldly things taken by themselves are regarded as contingent. Individual things do not come from themselves or proceed by themselves. As contingent, they are destined to pass away. This is something that does not happen to them simply contingently, but is constitutive of their nature. So here already you start just from observing things empirically and seeing, okay, things arise and pass away.
Yeah, if there's like a change in what's going on.
There's a reversal, So the contingent has a necessity to be contingent, which is weird.
Yeah. So like, what's contingent will be contingent by necessity. Okay, I have a suspicion, and because I don't fully understand this, but I have a suspicion that maybe he's also going to talk about necessity as in like the necessity of the mind to have a way to really think of this information as intelligible, so maybe like the necessity of intelligibility. I don't know.
It's always in the background. But here it's just think about it like literally in the logical terms. If something is contingent, it arises and passes away. And the whole point of contingency is contingency upon.
Being contingent. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. So contingency has its own necessity as contingency, which is even if the course. Yeah, go ahead.
And to go to a video on Hegel's method, this would be an example of, with immanent critique, the inner contradictory relations, right?
Yeah, this would be an example of a dialectic arising. So even if the course they follow is one that develops within them and is guided by rule and law, it goes on until it reaches their end, or rather leads only to their end. In like fashion, their existence is infringed upon by other things in all kinds of ways and is brought to an end by external factors. If they are regarded as conditioned, then their conditions are things that exist independently outside of them, which may or may not correspond to them, and by which they may or may not be temporally sustained. Initially, they are seen to be coordinated in space without being connected by any further relation that is part of their nature. This is a direct critique of Hume's views that, experience is just like these contingent, unrelated arisings and coming to be and ceasing to be of phenomena, experiences.
Yeah, it's
happenings.
It sort of feels like an abandonment of the inquiry into like why that's on.
But the most heterogeneous elements are found side by side, and they can be separated without injury to each other's existence. So, in order to consider them contingently, you must consider themselves independently from each other as well, because then they would constitute connections, but those connections then ask for a reason why, and this would bring in necessity. Similarly, they follow one another externally in time. They are, in fact, finite, and however independent they may seem, they are essentially devoid of independence because of the limitations of their finitude. And so here contradictions arise that, if we take them independent of each other, nonetheless they are finite, and therefore this constitutes dependent necessarily because of what finitude is, because it's a relationship of other to other. A finite which ends and begins at a finite and ends at another finite.
Yeah, but it produces an infinite, right? The finite.
Well, it produces an infinitude of infinite series of finites.
Right, because like by nature of being finitude, it needs to then thus have a new, it has to have like a new beginning, right?
Yeah, so
Isn't that what Hegel calls false infinity?
yeah, spurious infinity. They are actual, but their actuality has the value merely of possibility. They are, but can equally well not be as not be. Can equally well not be as be. Okay, so I think that's fairly clear that whichever way we take contingency, whether we take it empirically or we take it logically, we are going to be forced to reckon with the fact that there is a necessity in this contingency, no matter which way you spin it. There's either going to be an ontological conditional necessity, which would be just the contingency of finitude. There's also the logical necessity of contingency necessarily being contingent and therefore positing its own conditions of positing its own nexus of conditions around itself in order to determine whether it is or is not. And because even if you just take it empirically, again, the fact that it is, and and people might want to say that's actual, and he says even if they are actual, what they are actually are, at least to the understanding that looks upon them only as these independent, ephemeral, disconnected events or qualities, whatever or experiences, this itself leads you into the necessary contradiction of them being merely possible, that they could be as not be. Well, they are, therefore now you're locked into having to give a reason as to why they are. So I think this is like three forms in which you cannot escape this dialectic.
Wait, so can you repeat that last part, specifically why you're locked in? Like just that last bit.
Because if the phenomena you're looking at are being is a determinate being. These are not indeterminate being. They're not nothing. And determinate being is already a relationship of existence, which is a relationship of finitude, which already posits then a chain of finite entities which condition each other. So just to say like, oh, well, here's a color, but that color is something distinct and independent from the body, which is distinct and independent from the sound or whatever. That very distinction locks you into having to give an explanation then. Okay, everything is contingent in and of itself. But contingency only tells us it may be or not be. Well, it is, so now why is it?
Yeah, I see. And like the why is it is specifically where you're locked into. If you follow the logic, is the idea, right?
Yeah. So their existence discloses, however, not only connections between conditions, dependencies owing to which things come to be characterized as contingent, but also connections of cause and effect, the rule govern behavior of the inner and outer course of action, laws. These dependencies, conforming to law, raise worldly things above the category of contingency to necessity, and the latter thus appears within the sphere that we have thought of as occupied only by contingencies. Contingency claims things in virtue of isolation or singularization, therefore they may equally exist or not exist, but they are just as much the opposite, not isolated but utterly related to each other, as determinate and delimited. But they are no better off as a result of this opposing determinacy. Isolation lends them the semblance of independence, but their connection with other things, that is, with each other, expresses the fact that individual things are at the same time not independent, shows that they are conditioned and affected by other things, that they are necessary by means of other things, not by means of themselves. So that's the fact that we recognize the determinate relation, which gives us conditionality, then causes, well, rather forces us to become committed to a notion of causes as to how they are conditioning each other in order to bring each other into existence. And therefore the contingent, as contingent, disappears and must become necessary. So the contingent is that which is not merely is expanded into that which is not merely that which could be or not be, but now that which is by necessity of another, that which is by an external necessity. Thus, these necessities themselves, these laws, are what constitute the independent element. Anything that anything that exists essentially in a nexus of connection finds its determinate character and stability not in itself, but in this connection. It is the connection upon which things are dependent, but these connections, when defined as causes and effects, the condition and the fact of being conditioned, etc., are themselves limited in character and are contingent in relation to each other, in the sense that any of them may equally exist or not exist, and may just as easily be disturbed by circumstances. That is, interrupted by contingencies or demolished by their efficacy and validity as the individual things over which they have no advantage in the matter of contingency. So here, on the general sense, the general meaning of conditionality, the contingent becomes necessary in the form of causality. But on the concrete level of causality, any singular thing that is causal and efficacious, or in effect affected by a cause, itself, because it is determinate and because it is finite, requires a further finite to then condition it in order to provide the reason for why it exists. And so therefore, finite causality becomes contingent. And causality itself becomes contingent upon its own effects as well, or the cause. The conditioned is itself conditioned by the contingency. Does that make sense?
Like the interrelations of the contingency condition the contingency to be contingent?
That the necessity, because it's being related here to contingency.
I see what you mean. Okay, so because the necessity because the necessity of contingency is necessarily contingent, that the contingency then conditions itself necessarily based on the contingency or the necessity. Is that better?
I think you mixed up a couple words there, but you basically got it. It's that the necessity itself is only necessary through its contingent conditionals. So the contingency becomes necessary through its determinate relationship of to other things. But those other things then make its necessity contingent, because those other things themselves are also contingent upon other conditionals.
Okay, so how I'm actually imagining this is, so like I'm kind of imagining like a moment, so sort of like a snapshot of just the world, the everything, and like within that, you have your set of contingent relationships, and with any given contingent object, because of the necessity of contingency, in that moment, it is the necessity of those determinants together which affect it that then shape the contingency. That's what I'm that's where my mind is going with this.
You think of having a circle of contingencies, each dependent upon one another, and their dependence upon one another is necessary for any given contingency to itself be contingent. And so the necessity as a whole is an independent necessity that is resolved into out of the circle of conditions.
I think that's what I was envisioning in my snapshot example of my visualization of the moment.
Yeah, and the correlate to that is that then the totality of that necessity, if it is an existent entity itself, necessarily is contingent. Like a living organism is the perfect example. Dogs exist as a species and generate themselves necessarily as a species, as the kind of being that they are. But dogs, so dogs are necessary to dogs. They reproduce a species. It has a perfect circle of self-generation. But these dogs this necessity of the dog, while necessary within itself, which necessitates it's the internal elements contingent upon its total universal concreteness. The dog itself, the genus, the universal concreteness here, is itself contingent, because if the Earth is gone, goodbye dogs. Meteor strikes us, goodbye dogs. We have a solar flare, goodbye dogs. We decided that we don't like them, and just like the buffalo, we end up annihilating them. Goodbye dogs. So that necessity is itself contingent.
Okay, so this is my thinking on it. Is it because you have these contingencies which are contingent upon other contingencies, creates a circle of contingencies that is necessary because they're necessarily contingent. It's this one circle of necessity. It's internally necessary, but is it externally contingent because it is contingent upon these contingencies being contingent upon each other? That makes sense?
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. So anything that is empirically finite is going to suffer this fate. It's impossible not to. And this is why Hegel sees an impossibility of nature to attain to proper absolute being.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
So continuing, by contrast, those connections to which necessity must be attributed are not in any sense what we call things, but rather abstractions. So speaking of laws, if the connection of necessity manifests itself in the field of contingent things, in laws, and chiefly in relations of cause and effect, this necessity itself is something conditioned, limited, and in fact external. It is itself relegated to the category of things in respect to its isolation or externality on the one hand, and its conditionedness, limitation, and dependence on the other. In the connection of causes and effects, not only do we find the satisfaction that is lacking in the empty, unrelated isolation of things, which are just for this reason called contingent, but also the indefinite abstraction involved in the world of things. The variableness in them disappears in this relationship of necessity, in which things become causes, original facts, substances that are active and indeterminate. But in the connections of this sphere, the causes themselves are finite. Okay, sorry, let me just reread that. It is itself relegated to the category of things in respect to... Let me just start from the top. If the connection of necessity manifests itself in the field of contingent things, in laws, and chiefly in relations of cause and effect, this external necessity is something conditioned, limited, and in fact external. Okay, the way I'm thinking about this is, say like gravity, where the way that people normally think of gravity is that they don't think that gravity is something immanent to matter. They think gravity is something that has power over matter, but which is distinct from matter. That there could be. This is why people speak of weird stuff like mass, and gravity being distinct things, like now we believe, well, not we, because I definitely don't believe this and I don't accept it, but I'm one of the few. But most people buy into this whole thing, the Higgs boson. The Higgs boson is what is the particle which is the specific abstract manifestation of a field which is called the Higgs field, in which matter moves through it and has mass by virtue of it. This would make mass something that is a contingency in relationship to matter. Like, there is no necessary connection here. Matter could be without mass, and this field which gives mass could also be without matter. Gravity likewise can, or that which would manifest gravity if there was matter around, is independently and external to that which is gravitated, which is matter, with mass particularly. So if the connection of necessity manifests itself in the field of contingent things, in laws, and chiefly in relations of cause and effect, this necessity itself is something conditioned, limited, and in fact external. It is itself relegated to the category of things in respect to its isolation or externality on the one hand, and its conditionedness, limitation, and dependence on the other. So it itself relegated to the category of things, so the connection of like finite things in respect to isolation to externality on the one hand, and its conditionedness, limitation, dependence on the other. In the connection of causes and effects, not only do we find the satisfaction that is lacking in the empty, unrelated isolation of things, which are just for this reason called contingent, but also the indefinite abstraction involved in the world of things. The variableness in them disappears in this relationship of necessity in which things become causes, original facts, substances that are active and indeterminate. Okay, so here the contingency disappears. But in the connections of this sphere, the causes themselves are finite. Beginning as causes, their being is again isolated and therefore contingent. Or it is not isolated in that case, their effects, and therefore not independent. Oh, okay, so forget what I said. That was a bad example. Maybe related, but it's not what Hegel's talking about. Hegel's just talking about that. Okay. So we set up these laws, forces, causes, which are the conditions of the contingent finite things. But these causes, the way we normally think about it is that, or at least the way people who were rational back in Hegel's day thought about it was that, okay, there wasn't such a thing as forces as such. Forces are just these communications of bodies to bodies. And so therefore, you would say that there's a cause for everything. But part of the foundational projects of the Enlightenment was that the buck has to stop somewhere. So, all these things are contingent, and they must have a final single necessity grounding them all. And when you got to that necessity, it's a cause with effects, which is not necessarily, which usually has no explanation as to why the effects proceed from the cause as the particular effects they are. But this cause is itself unconditioned, or at least they want to take it as unconditioned. But if it's unconditioned, the only thing they can say is like, well, it just is what it is. But if it just is what it is, and we have no reason as to why it is, necessarily, why the necessity of this necessity, then this thing must be contingent, and therefore falls again. The whole system of necessity caused by the determining all these contingencies relating to each other. If the final necessity itself has no necessity, then the whole series is contingent. And the necessity that we have attained is merely a contingent necessity. Makes sense to me.
Yeah, so it's external.
Yeah.
It isn't because of, like... Would it be wrong to say that it's contingent because all of the, like, moments in it themselves are contingent? That isn't why it's contingent.
No, it's because the final it's because the final condition itself is a finite condition, despite what people may say. They want to say, no, this is the infinite condition, but they can't actually prove it. So all they end up doing is they just state, well, it is. But that which is, and which is just simply abstractly in itself, is contingent. So it may be just as well as not be. Therefore, the whole series is only a relative necessity, but not an absolute necessity, and therefore the whole thing is contingent.
The best part about Hegel, making all this movement to go back where you started.
Okay, but in the connections of the sphere, the causes are themselves but in the connections of the sphere, the causes themselves are finite, beginning as causes. Their being is again isolated and therefore contingent, or it is not isolated. In that case, they are effects and therefore not independent but posited through an other. The series of causes and effects are partly contingent vis-a-vis each other and partly continued of themselves into the so-called infinite. Thus, they have as their content nothing but the situations and modes of existence of which each is finite on its own account, and what ought to give stability to the connection of the series, the infinite is not only a beyond, but also a mere negative, whose very meaning is merely relative to and conditioned by what ought to be negated by it, but for this reason is not negated. All right, I think that's pretty clear. Spirit, however, elevates itself above this mass of contingencies, above the merely external and relative necessity involved in them, above the infinite that is merely a negative, and obtains to a necessity that no longer goes beyond itself, but is in and for itself, is enclosed within itself, and is determined as complete within itself, while all other determinations are posited by it and are dependent on it. So you can see how he uses the question to not really bother with going in the usual ways of answering the question, but just simply saying what are the concepts that are really problematic, that are really constituting the problem here. What is the actual content determination of the issue? And he says, well, the problem here is what's the issue of contingency and necessity. And then he goes on and he does what Hegel does best. Just thinks through the contents, looks at their relationships and conditions internal to themselves, and shows a dialectic. The proofs and logic. Set forth in vaguer or more concentrated form, these are likely to be the essential aspects of thought residing in the inner life of the human spirit, residing in the reason that has not attained methodically and formally to an awareness of its inner processes, and still less to the investigation of those categories of thoughts through which it passes and of the connections they involve. Our task now, however, is to see whether the thinking that does reason in a formal and methodical way rightly comprehends and expresses that process of elevation which we thus far have assumed to be factual and have been accustomed to deal with only in terms of a few fundamental aspects. Conversely, we must determine whether those thoughts and their connections can be shown to be justified and corroborated by investigating thought in itself. For it is only in this way that the elevation truly ceases to be a presupposition, and the unstable aspect of any right conception of it falls away. But we must decline to enter into this investigation here, because if it is advanced on its own account, we should have to proceed to the ultimate analysis of thought. This investigation has to be carried out in logic, the science of thought, for I combine logic and metaphysics. The latter likewise is nothing other than reflection on what is indeed a concrete content, such as God, world, the soul, in such a way that these objects are to be comprehended as noumena, that is, in their ideational aspect. Here will be preferable to take up only the logical results rather than the formal developments. In this respect, a treatment of the proofs of the existence of God cannot be conducted independently if it is expected to have philosophical and scientific completeness. Science is the developed connectional nexus of the idea in its totality, insofar as any individual object is lifted out of the totality for which the science of the idea must strive as the sole means of demonstrating its truth. Limits must be set to its treatment, as is assumed to be the case in other scientific procedures. Still, the treatment may come to have an appearance of independence because the unexamined presuppositions, which constitute the limits of the presentation, and which analysis reaches in due course, are themselves in harmony with consciousness. Every work contains such ultimate notions or fundamental principles by which the content is supported consciously or unconsciously. In every work there is an uncircumscribed horizon of thought that it does not further analyze. The horizon rests on the culture of an age or a people or of some scientific circle beyond which there is no need to go. Indeed, it would be prejudicial to what is called popular understanding to attempt to go beyond these limits of representational thinking by analyzing them in terms of speculative concepts. Nevertheless, since the subject of these lectures belongs essentially and on its own account to the domain of philosophy, we cannot dispense with abstract concepts. We have, however, already set forth these concepts that belong to this first standpoint, and we need only to arrange them in order to attain to the speculative level, for the speculative consists on the whole in nothing other than bringing together the thoughts that we already have. Thus, the thoughts that have already been indicated consist firstly of the following main aspects. A thing or law, etc., is contingent in virtue of its isolation. Whether it exists or not does not disturb or alter things. The fact that it is so little sustained by them, and that any stability it derives from them is wholly insufficient, gives to them the insufficient show of independence that precisely constitutes their contingency. By contrast, the necessity of an existing thing requires that it stand in some connection with other things, such that, regarded in any of its aspects, it is seen to be completely determined by other existing things that function as conditions and causes. It cannot be separated from them or come into being on its own, nor cannot there be any condition, cause, or circumstance of connection by means of which it could be so separated, nor any such circumstance that could contradict the one that determines it. In accord with this specification, we place the contingency of a thing in its isolation in the lack of a complete connection with other things. This is the first point. Conversely, however, since an existing thing stands in a condition of complete connection, it is in all aspects conditioned and dependent, and thus completely lacking in independence. In necessity alone, rather, do we find the independence of a thing. What is necessary must be. Its having to be expresses its independence in such a way that what is necessary is because it is. This is the other point. You don't hear that mentioned very much, but it's actually true. Hegel is the guy who finally proves that it is very meaningful to say that that which is what it is because it is what it is. Let's see, how long is this? Okay. The nature of necessity. We thus see that the necessity of something requires two sorts of opposed qualities. Its independence, in which, however, it is isolated, and whether it is or is not is a matter of indifference, and its being based on and contained in a complete relation to everything else by which it is surrounded and through the nexus of which it is sustained, so that it is not independent. The necessity is a recognized factor as well as the contingency. In terms of the first way of representing things, everything is found in an orderly connection. The contingent is different from the necessary and points to a necessity, which, however, when more closely examined, itself falls back under contingency just because, being posited by another, it is dependent. But when it is removed from such a connection, it is isolated and at once immediately contingent. The intended distinctions are thus only imagined. Since it is not our intention to examine further the nature of these thoughts, and since we wish for the time being to set aside the opposition of necessity and contingency, and remain with the first, we shall confine ourselves to what is suggested by our representation, that neither the Neither of the determinate qualities alone is sufficient for necessity. Rather, both are required. Independence, so that the necessity is not mediated by another, but just as much the mediation or necessity with the other. Thus, independence and mediation contradict each other, but since at the same time they belong to the one necessity, they must not contradict each other in the unity by which they are united in it. For the sake of our insight, the thoughts that are united in this necessity must also be brought together in us. In this unity, accordingly, mediation with an other will partake of independence, and the latter, as self-relatedness, will have mediation with an other within itself. In this specification, however, the two can only be united in such a way that the mediation with an other is at the same time a mediation with self. That is, the union is such that the mediation with an other sublates itself and becomes a mediation with self. This unity with self is not a unity that is abstract identity, such as we saw in the isolation in which the thing is related only to itself, and in which its contingency lies. The one-sidedness, because of which alone it is, in contradiction with the equally one-sided mediation by an other, is thus sublated, and these untruths have disappeared. Unity thus characterized is the true unity, and when truly known is the speculative unity. Since it unifies in itself these opposed qualities, necessity is thus defined. As thus defined, is seen to be something more than a simple representation and a simple determinateness. So, independence, mediation, united in necessity. In this unity, accordingly, mediation with an other will partake of independence. The latter of self-relatedness will have mediation with an other within itself. The other within itself is an important point. In this specification, however, the two can only be united in such a way that the mediation with an other is at the same time a mediation with self. That is, the union is such that the mediation with an other sublates itself and becomes a mediation with self. Thus, unity with self is not a unity that is abstract identity, such as we saw in the isolation, in which the thing is related only to itself and in which its contingency lies. So, abstract identity would just be, the abstract identity here in this example would be like just saying, oh, the apple is an apple. But the self-necessity, or the necessity of the apple to be itself, would be, well, the apple is this whole system of the self-generation of apple trees, germination, growth, maturation, pollination, the fruiting process, ripening, and all these other things, and therefore the apple then provides the entire living being of the seed, which then also begins the process anew, and therefore confirms the identity of the apple as indeed being the being that it is necessarily. The one-sidedness, because of which alone it is in contradiction with the equally one-sided mediation by an other, is thus sublated, and thus untruths. And these untruths have disappeared. So in the truth, we neither have just the immediate identity nor the immediate mediation. So it's not just like an abstract something and an abstract other, but rather it's the return of something to itself as the other of the other. All right, continuing. Furthermore, the sublation of the opposed qualities is not merely our affair and our doing, as though it is something that we alone have brought about. Rather, the nature and the activity of these qualities themselves is such as to unify them in a single quality. Likewise, the two elements of necessity, that its mediation with an other is in itself, and that it sublates this mediation and posits itself as itself precisely for the sake of its unity, are not separate acts. In the mediation with the other, it relates itself to itself. In other words, the other through which it mediates itself with itself is itself. Thus, it is negated as an other. It is itself the other, but only momentarily, without introducing the quality of time into the concept, a quality that first appears in relation to the existence of the concept. This other being is essentially something that is sublated. It's in existence. It appears also as a real other, but absolute necessity is the necessity that is adequate to its concept. And that is lecture 11. Pretty good. Not much to say for most of it, but that section on the actual dialectic of the concepts of contingency and necessity was really good. So okay, next time we will continue with lecture 12. Unless anybody has any further questions or comments, we will leave it at that. Okay. For those of you listening, hopefully you find this interesting. See you next time.